One of the most interesting aspects of visual novels compared to most media is its relative length per entry. Unlike anime and manga, which are divided into 20 pages or 20 minutes spurts, or movies, which are at most 2 hours at a time, visual novels have some of the widest potential lengths, with some being as short as a few hours and some going well over 80 hours. Personally, I think many visual novels, especially story-heavy ones, tend to lean a bit too much on going too long, which unfortunately tends to bring down the experience for me. So in this video, I'm going to go over a handful of visual novels to explain what I would consider good and bad lengths for visual novels. I'm going to structure this video into 3 main categories. The first will be a few visual novels that I would say are good lengths, especially for its genre. The second would be visual novels that I did overall like, but I potentially would have loved if they weren't so long. The third category will be visual novels that straight up got ruined for me almost purely due to how long it was. Let's start off with a positive note and give the first of few visual novels I would say is my ideal length, Sharin no Kuni, developed by Akabe Soft 2. It's a charage, or drama-focused visual novel with a heavy emphasis on psychological character development. It's a 100% linear visual novel that's divided into 5 chapters, but somehow they were able to find a way to fit in romance routes by having the main character, Kenichi, find some romance time with the heroine she chose, even if it's only for like an hour each at most. The 5 chapters are about 4 to 6 hours each, which I think is perfect for the story it's trying to tell. Chapter 1 is the typical common route stuff with your character introductions, and it gives you just enough about each character where you want to see the main character try to attempt to fix the main heroine in question. And each chapter after 1 is all about the main character helping out each of them separately. Each chapter goes just enough into each character and develop them enough and doesn't stay too long on a particular one. That way, you can go on to the next story in a timely manner, and the way everything ties together by the ending makes Sharin no Kuni, at least for me, the perfect example of how to do a linear-ish story in terms of length. The next visual novel I would consider to be the ideal length is one of my all-time favorite moege, Making Lovers. Making Lovers has a kind of unique case where the common route is extremely short, having less than an hour tops, and 1 to 3 early choices is enough to lock you onto a heroine route. However, what I consider to be a positive trade-off is how the system makes it so you lock onto one heroine at a time for about 4 to 6 hours each. Many times, moege force you to do 5 to 10 hour common routes to get to know each heroine first, and that's not necessarily a bad thing, but the main issue with a lot of moege is they hit you with a lot of the usual boring harem tropes, comedy included, which doesn't help the heroines really stick out, and you have to deal with them for about 5 to 10 hours before you get to choose and see their development. With Making Lovers, after just a choice or two, you get right into the romance, and while it is still mostly slice of life, SME's focus on switching between its goofy unique comedy and its wholesome romantic development make it so even if you were to only read 1 or 2 routes, you can still go in and have a good time. But if you do decide to read all 5 routes, you clock in at about 30 hours, which I consider a good investment with how much Making Lovers does not waste your time. For the last visual novel I would consider ideal length, I'm going to cover the recently released in English NUKITASHI by Krupo. I wanted to cover at least one visual novel that has the typical route system with a common route and true route. And honestly, I thought NUKITASHI was one of the best paced and properly length visual novels in terms of getting into the story and not wasting too much of your time. VNDB says the average length of people who read NUKITASHI is about 40 hours. For my estimation, the common route and the first 3 routes are all about 5 to 8 hours each, with the true route being a little longer at 8 to 10 hours. To me, this is a good amount because it allows each route to develop each of its unique themes and antagonists. What helps is that it tends to mix in its goofy comedy in the story while not compromising its development, pacing, including in the action scenes. It wants to focus on just enough to set you up for the true route, which ties everything together. Each route focuses just a good amount of time on the theme it's trying to tell, and in the true route, any plot threads that are similar to previous routes are skimmed over to allow for the new stuff to come a lot quicker, while still feeling like things aren't particularly rushed. Overall, to me, NUKITASHI is the perfect example of how to do a true route structured visual novel in terms of length. Now I want to go into the second category, visual novels which I did like, but I would have potentially loved if they were quite a bit shorter. The first being the ever so popular Muv-Luv Trilogy. Muv-Luv Alternative is generally considered in the top 3 highest rated visual novels in the West, and it's pretty easy to see why. It has some of the most hard-hitting emotional developments and moments in all the visual novels. However, there's a big reason why some people are hesitant to recommend Muv-Luv at times, and it's purely because how long it takes to read all of the 3 main stories, Extra, Unlimited, and Alternative. Going by VNDB, the average reading length for all 3 stories is about 100 hours in total. However, it's not just the total length of reading the whole series that would be a turnoff, it's the fact that the Muv-Luv series relies on this huge tonal shift to make itself stick out. And unfortunately, not everybody is going to like the wacky comedy adventures in Muv-Luv Extra. Most people say in order to get the most out of the emotional moments in Alternative, reading at least the mandatory 2 routes in Extra, as well as just 1 route in Unlimited is the bare minimum. but even then, it's still at least decently recommended to read every route in Extra, because there's going to be a bunch of elements referred to them in Alternative. However, even Alternative by itself has its own issues. I'll say the absolute biggest issue is its info dumping that it has before each major fight. I get some people like the whole military thing about figuring out the proper strategies about how the characters have to properly fight the beta. However, this is not going to apply to everybody, and these scenes could have easily been cut down to like a couple of minutes at most to heavily summarize what the plans are. However, there's many other things about Alternative's links that I bring down due to padding, including the fight scenes themselves not being that engaging due to how long they are, as well as the goofy sprite movements, as well as a very particular moment towards the end of the game which has forced auto-read for at least 30 minutes. As said in the beginning, I did enjoy Muv-Luv Trilogy and would recommend it. It has some of the best emotional moments in any visual novel, and the themes it does tell do a great job of immersing you in. I just personally wish if Extra, Unlimited, and Alternative were cut in half each lengthwise, I think it could have still told the same story, but get to the point a lot quicker in every aspect. The next visual novel that I overall liked but did not love more due to its length is Hoshizora no Memoria. In this particular case, I think the common route was way too long. If I recall, it was at least 10 hours, and it most definitely did not to be that length. I get it's nice to have detailed character introductions, and there were some nice drama moments and foreshadowing for future events. However, this is the perfect example of a visual novel that goes way too much into repetitive, unfunny slice-of-life comedy. It says something when the first hour of the game is constantly dealing with one of the most annoying little sister characters in visual novel history, the pink devil herself, Chinami. However, a lot of the common route deals with the main character and others joining or dealing with the astronomy club, and many of these scenes could have easily been shortened or straight up removed to preserve a better balance between the little drama scenes and the foreshadowing to the character routes. While the character routes themselves aren't as bad, I still think a whole bunch of slice-of-life comedy loops could have been shortened or be less repetitive to get to the good stuff quicker. Admittedly, I'm kind of biased because I'm not a fan of heroines beating up the main character physically or verbally for no reason, and this visual novel does it in spades, which is what ends up contributing to a lot of the repetitive slice-of-life comedy beats. I did overall like Hoshi because it has a nice art style and each and every heroine route has something interesting going on. I just wish it cut down on the repetitive, unfunny parts and it could have been a lot higher for me. What's probably going to be the most controversial entry in this whole list is Umineko, but honestly, this section applies to Ryukishi07, the writer in general. I personally have said before that this is a guy that heavily needs an editor. Umineko is just the easiest of his titles to talk about purely because it's by far his longest series. I already know a bunch of Umineko simps are probably going to come in here to defend Umineko's length, but I don't care. If you just look at the VNDB average lengths for the question and answer arcs combined, you're looking at just under 150 hours of your time to read the whole thing on average. As someone who has read the entire thing twice, it did not need to be this long. I get that this is a mystery visual novel with a bunch of details to be provided so you can potentially solve the mystery by yourself by the end. However, I'm going to quickly go over what I think makes Ryukishi07 the ultimate time waster himself. In Umineko Episode 1, what should be a simple beginning in setting the mood and characters becomes a frustrating slog with how long it takes to introduce the characters to the island with a whole bunch of, I guess you can call, slice of life scenes between the kids and parents arguing over who should get the family inheritance. I think these scenes alone could have easily been cut in half to get to the good parts of episode 1 a lot quicker while still introducing the characters. However, once you get to episode 2, you'll slowly get to 3 things that I think overall hurts Umineko's pacing a lot. The ridiculously long flashbacks, the overly intense amounts to details in the slice of life moments, and the meta magic fights. I get that the initial twist of Umineko is that it wasn't just a simple mystery story, and one of the recurring themes is potentially convincing the reader that the murders are through magic. However, once you realize what Ryukishi07 was really trying to convey with this reality versus magic stuff, it retroactively made me dislike how much the series wasted time in this meta stuff that could have been more in the emotional murder mystery stuff instead. It sucks because I would say I still overall like Umineko. It has entertaining characters, the actual murder mysteries are pretty interesting to figure out, the atmosphere can be good, and there are some pretty interesting plot twists. I just think this is a perfect example of a visual novel that gets bogged down by way too many unnecessary details. I'd go as far as to say that I would have much preferred each and every episode to be cut in half at least lengthwise, which would have been enough to increase my overall score of the whole series by at least 1 point. Now let's get into some visual novels where their length actively ruined my experience. But the first is what I consider to be one of the most overrated visual novels ever in DS Irae. I knew going in that this was going to be what people like to call a chunige, but outside of that, I just expected this to be like Fate Stay Night but with Nazi villains. One of the things that many fans praise DS Irae for is its villains, but unfortunately for me, they are easily the worst part of this visual novel, but more specifically, it's once there's an action scene against one of them. Oh boy, As I started to see more fight scenes against these villains, I slowly started to dread more and more the prospect of having to go through these edgy slogs of fight scenes. Let's put this into perspective real quick. DS Irae has 4 routes, but according to VNDB, the average read time of the whole visual novel is 80 hours. Much of these 80 hours are these ridiculously long fight scenes and other drawn out dialogue. It says something when there's some scenes that go so long they have to switch from ADV to NVL. Long action scenes like these could be fine if they were entertaining like NUKITASHI or interesting in a strategic way like Fate Stay Night. However, I just could not stand these action scenes when it was just the main villains having multiple essays of long, edgy monologues during the fights. It felt like some were trying to be weirdly philosophical, but many times I was just telling the antagonist to shut up and get to the point. It sucks because, as I said earlier, DS Irae had a kind of interesting premise with potentially interesting characters in theory, but any intrigue I had about the villains was pretty much brought down by those drawn-out, edgy action scenes and monologues alone. The only visual novel in this video that I've straight up fully dropped due to its length is Hoshizora Yume Mirai by Toneworks. Given that I'm a moege slice of life fan, you would think something that's basically a wholesome slice of life romance would be something that appeals to me, especially since Hoshizora has little to no unnecessary drama and there's not too much of the usual crappy anime harem humor jokes like tsundere hitting and stuff. However, I think Hoshizora has the problem where it just goes way too far in the other direction. The common route tries to make you go through every single detail that the main protagonist has to go through, including how long it takes for him to move into his new apartment and how he talks to his boss that he looks up to. However, even that aside, the slice of life is, even for my standards, very dull just because how long they spend on each individual scene. It's not like this visual novel is completely aimless. There is the whole thing where the main character eventually has to help the heroines achieve their dreams through the club he joins. However, just the amount of time it took for the main character to talk to every single main heroine and get them all together was agonizingly dull. It sucks because I think the main heroines, base personality-wise, are actually kind of likable. I was really excited to read Hoshizora given how widely praised it was, and the fact that it apparently has a few time skips in the actual route, which is something that is pretty unique. However, I could just not get over how long this visual novel spends on useless, dull events even for my standards. If they cut down the length of the common route in half, that might have been enough to keep my motivation going. Unfortunately, I dropped the visual novel when I got to about the first H scene of Misa's route. She was the character I was most interested in, but even when I got into her route, I was still bored out of my mind due to how long they spent on stuff that didn't really matter for me. I just wanted them to move on to the next thing. I've tried many times to continue and complete at least one route of Hoshizora Yume Mirai, and I just couldn't do it. The final visual novel I'm going to talk about, where its length ruined my enjoyment, is the Grisaia series. This is going to be a weird one because I've finished and I would say I enjoyed the original Fruit of Grisaia. However, I would definitely say its length was easily its biggest flaw and exhausted me enough to the point where it lowered my motivation to read the sequels. It was to the point that I ended up just watching the anime adaptations of the sequels, Labyrinth and Eden of Grisaia, because I thought those stories fit the anime medium more anyway. But that said, what is up with the Grisaia series? Here's the weird thing, I actually like what I call the two extremes that Grisaia has. The common route is basically a pure comedy slice of life, and for the most part, it was pretty funny. Not the most hilarious humor ever, but definitely enough to entertain me. However, the issue is that it was basically 10 to 15 hours of a lot of the same gags with minor differences. There's like maybe a few scenes of foreshadowing and potential drama, but you mostly just kept getting more and more jokes until you finally got onto the mini ladder structure of the end of the common route to actually get onto a heroine route. I would say all 5 heroine routes actually have something pretty interesting drama going on. You get to see more to the psychology of all 5 main heroines and see the real reason why they joined the academy. The tone gets much more serious, and it's pretty easy to feel for the characters when you see what they've been through. However, the issue, once again, comes to how ridiculously long almost every route is. Every single aspect just goes on way too long, from the build-up to the darker aspects of each character, to the flashbacks, and even the main source of the drama. What doesn't help is that once you get to the darker stuff, it's just a constant source of exhausting depression, and doesn't even necessarily stop when Yuji and the main heroine in question get together romantically. Maki and his route is what I consider the worst in the length aspect. It just took way too long for anything of interest to happen, and while the actual good parts were kinda interesting, it's hard to keep my motivation to keep reading, going through the slower, exhausting parts, which there were quite a lot of. As said earlier, I did eventually finish the Fruit of Grisaia, but the pain of the really slow pacing and unnecessary long length caused me to not read the sequels in visual novel form, even though they intrigued me. To make a small tangent that's kind of related to the topic of this video, I don't think just reading short visual novels is the ideal either. I'm talking about visual novels that are less than 10 hours on average. It's one of the many reasons why I don't like Sai no Uta by Nitro Plus. Even if I kind of got what the themes of Sai no Uta were, I just did not think there was enough development for Fuminori and Saya for me to get attached to their story. Same deal with Planetarian by Key. It had an interesting concept, but unlike the 50+ hour development of the usual cryfest of other Key visual novels, Planetarian being around 5 to 6 hours made it hard for me to get attached to the characters and feel the intended feels by the end. But anyway, that's it. While I don't think all visual novels are too long, I think there are quite a bunch that I think are longer than they need to be, and I only just gave a handful of examples. I'm curious what other people's opinions are about and what they would consider good lengths for a visual novel, or what they think is too long or too short. Feel free to leave your opinion on that in a comment below.